More than 30 years ago, one of the fashionable ideas was a borderless world. However, since then, we have observed the appearance of new borders, new walls, and the international border has appeared as a selective and optimized filter for the benefit of states and markets. Classically, migration studies explore all mobility regimes of human groups. There is a spectrum of public policies ranging from the migration of high-skilled workers to refugees. For the migration studies, national borders provide a form of social closure. Several authors have pointed out a form of gap between border studies and migration studies, that there was a lack of cross-fertilization between these two research traditions. Welcome to the Borders in Globalization podcast. Welcome to our listeners. I'm speaking from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen peoples in the Salish Sea region. Today, we are going to talk in 2 episodes about democracy, migration studies, and border studies, bridges and/or gaps, with Oliver Schmidtke, political scientist and director of the Center for Global Studies at the University of Victoria, Canada. It's great to see you, Oliver. Welcome to this podcast for Borders in Globalization.
Thank you for having me, Ben.
So, Oliver, let's start our first part. This first part will focus on borders and migration, and the second part will concern borders and democracy. Traditionally, territorial borders refer to issues that are fundamental to political community, like the identity, the security, and the sovereignty. And for this reason, borders are also tools for regulating flows, policy tools for inclusion and exclusion. Borders are linked with the politics and governance of migrations. We know the rights of states to sovereignly control the entry and stay of foreigners on their territory. Oliver, first question to clear the ground a little. When we combine the 2 topics of migration and borders, we immediately think of the border as a tool for regulating and controlling migratory flows. The first question is very general. How do you see the links between migration studies and border studies?
Thank you for introducing this session, Ben, in this way, because it seems to be a paradoxical question. Because on the one hand, it seems obvious, right? Migration is largely governed through borders, right? It is hard to imagine international migration and not seeing how this happens through borders, not behind their backs, not in a hidden way. And so borders are those places where migration happens, where it is governed, where it is managed. And so in a fundamental way, borders make migration possible. So, that is the most obvious statement. But at the same time, and you alluded to this in your introduction, Ben, there seems to be a lack of cross-fertilization and exchange between border studies on the one hand and migration studies. Scholars have paid relatively little attention to what has happened in the other field over the years. And maybe it is based on a certain prejudice or misperception that is rooted also in a lack of knowledge. Because you could see how scholars and the wider public, they might look at border studies and say, oh, that is more policy-oriented, technocratic, maybe neoliberal, conservative, is fixed on structures. Whereas migration studies seems to be more focused on human beings, on ethical issues, human agency, and so forth. So you could see how this clashes, and the perception by migration scholars is often those working on borders. They're interested in the technicalities of guarding borders, maybe the surveillance and all those things. However, they clearly have misrepresented or not read scholarship really on borders that have shown a great degree of interest of the impact of borders on people, on borders, landscapes, on a very multifaceted environment in which borders are enacted and governed. But you can see where this is coming from. And maybe, behind this is even a larger misconception that suggests that borders are either inherently good or they're inherently bad, right? So migration scholars and, those interested in migration, they might say, look, borders are there to contain migration, right? To limit it. And, their effect is necessarily negative, right? So they are really there to prevent people from doing what is really, should be considered a fundamental freedom of human beings to cross from one country into another. So in this respect, there is this, or, there are those that say we need these borders. We're going to come to this part. They are fundamental in protecting our sovereignty and our nation state, right? So it is, the scholarly debate is also shaped by a political debate about the nature of borders, right? And in this respect, I think a more nuanced way of looking at this, and this could be a good way of cross-fertilization and mutual learning, is to better understand how are borders actually governed, and how does migration play a role in how the flow of people across borders is monitored, is managed. Because even for open migration, you need borders, right? You need an instrument to allow people to cross these borders. So in this respect, borders, they do both. They exclude and include, they separate and integrate. There are boundaries, but there are also ports of entry for people. In this respect, there is a lot of mutual interest in flow of people, migrants, and practices of governments. But unfortunately, and due to misconceptions and maybe prejudices, this hasn't happened to the degree that I would have liked to see it in my work.
Thank you very much, Oliver. And I like this expression of a more nuanced way. Border studies have developed concepts such as bordering, debordering, mobile border, borderscapes, functional and aterritorial border. We observe a remote border control and the preclearance technique for goods, but also for human beings. We know also that exist different legal categories of migrants. In the literature, we also observe that migration is also thought of as a process of decolonization. Others speak about global apartheid. Another literature promotes a border abolitionism, which bridges critical migration and borders scholarship and carceral abolitionism. In general, a strong trend estimates that it's insane to talk about migrations without speaking about neoliberalism, imperialism, and colonialism. So my question is general regarding this context. How do migration studies mobilize the concept of border in their analysis of migration phenomena and the related policies?
I think what we've seen in border studies, and that has been quite helpful for migration studies as well, is to perceive of borders as something that is quite, or it relates to a diverse set of government practices. And borders are seen as increasingly fluid, they are mobile, they move away from our maybe oversimplified perception of a border of wall in the ground, on the ground, mortar, bricks. And border is something, it's a practice, government's practice that is being enacted through a host of tools of surveillance, monitoring, regulating. And, that is, I think, what we've seen as a broadening of these technologies. And you could argue, talking about the link between border and migration studies, that the interest in international migration, also the need to monitor an increasing amount of people who try to leave their country and go to other places in the globalizing world, that this has also pushed government, the border governance technologies, that the need for more surveillance, more knowledge, more tools for states to deal with this. Think about the Mexican-American border at the moment, right? So what are the proper instruments to manage this properly in a humane way? And, we're going to talk about this a bit later in this podcast. But so, the diversification of technologies and tools is also driven by the phenomenon of a deeply enlarged amount of people crossing international borders in a globalizing world. So that one is the technologies and the sight of borders. The other one is, I think, that more and more actors have engaged in shaping these borders, in governing these borders. So, if you can think about private industry, they have started to play an important role in selecting people who can cross borders. Private citizens, also in civil society organization, helping people desperate need to cross borders. I've done a bit of work on temporary foreign workers, and here it is quite obvious how this oversimplified model, a nation state controls the border at a particular point in time, and then decides who can come in and who is not coming in, who gets citizenship title, who gets permanent residence status. That is one element. But there are so many actors involved in enacting this border and the policies related to this. And the temporary foreign worker program was an interesting case to look at, to what degree should, let's say, private interest, corporate interest also drive this selection process. What is, how does state sovereignty manifest itself at the border in terms of shaping, the flow of people in and out of a country? So that is one of those effects of new technologies and also proliferation of those actors shaping border governance. Another one is that with these technologies, you can also, in a way, outsource or in a way avoid responsibility for some of the effects. If a border can be enacted outside of your territory, if, for example, the European Union now says maybe what we should have is asylum claims being managed outside of the European Union on, let's say, African continent in some kind of centers where we process these claims, you see how technology then can become a tool to avoid some of the hard questions related to the governance of people trying to cross international borders, right? So technology is also a way of distancing yourself from the more ugly and exclusionary aspects of border policies in this respect. So it is, I think, with technological change, there's also important implication for how we govern the flow of people across borders, how we enact rules, who's responsible, and what the implications for people on the ground is, right? How do they see this? Do borders become more impenetrable due to the technologies that are being applied? Right? So these are fascinating research questions and political questions for those studying these phenomena.
Thank you, Oliver. Migration studies examines multiple bordering processes, as you just shared with us. Borders beyond territorial limits, the check of documents and databases, and the effects of these policies on the lives of migrants, etc. And also, migration studies reveal to us that borders are not anymore a uniform area of control, but a complex institution and space that is controlled by different points and with different degrees of discrimination. We are going to speak about one possible type of border is the classical wall. We know the physical walls, but we forget the administrative walls. And these bureaucratic walls can be located very far from the national borders of a country. And you just spoke about that a little bit. We have an example of the agreement between United Kingdom and Rwanda. We have another example with the agreement between Italy and Albania. What are these different types of walls for migration studies and for the different categories of migrants? Can you share with us some good examples, please?
First of all, we have to be aware of the scale of the challenge we are talking here. At the moment, there are more than 270 million migrants around the world living outside of their country of birth. So this has become a mass phenomenon. But, you could say, we live in the epoch of migration and mobility. This is, and then also, those are often people who have chosen to live in another country. But at the end of 2022, about 110 million people worldwide were forcibly displaced as a result of persecution, conflict, violence, human rights violations, and so forth. So you have 110 million people who are often in desperate need to go to another place. And then these walls that you allude to, right? They become very real. If you don't have the proper administrative structure in place, you don't have the paperwork, you can't even reach these points where you can make a claim for asylum. So I think when we talk about walls, we have to be aware that it is very class-coded how these walls actually work. For the weakest, those who have the least rights, those who desperately try to get away from conflict and violence, for them, these walls are very real. They are impenetrable often. And, we've seen, I think you alluded to this in your introduction, how more and more walls have been built, physically, and borders have been fortified and militarized to keep people out very, clearly with the intent to prevent people from reaching the shores of those countries that are more privileged, that have the financial means and are attractive to many people. So you have, on the one hand, you have all these people who come, let's say, for travel, tourism, right? We see huge expansion of international mobility along those lines for the privileged. And on the other hand, the less affluent and less privileged ones, they experience the exclusionary nature of these borders, the walls, really, in a way, material obstacles to reach another place very clearly. And it speaks to something that migration scholars call also the liberal paradox in regulating migration. On the one hand, we have those Western rich countries that are in desperate need of the influx of newcomers to address an aging society, open positions in the labor market, their productivity. Canada is a good example, right? In a way, we define our productivity, our place in the world by attracting the brightest around the world to work in Canada and contribute to the economy. So it is a critical element of modernizing those countries. But the paradox is that there is often a very strong political opposition to attracting these people. Not so much in Canada, but around the world. You could see, we will talk about this in a second, strong, in a way, mobilization against the influx of these newcomers. So the wall becomes also a place of selection. Who is entitled, who is seen as worthy. I talked about temporary foreign workers, right? So they are often seen as labor that is invited in, but then could be disposed of at a certain point of time. So what are the commitments that we have towards these people who come in? So what we see here is very much a class-coded, very selective way of allowing people to cross this border or go through the wall in this respect. And I think you referred to this in your introduction, how in the 1990s, that was a time when I did my PhD. And, I still remember this sense of, these borders, they will disappear. It's a matter of time. And we are entering a period in which globalization will undo what divides people in terms of geographical location where they live. And what we've seen is actually a selective return, in terms of its impact on people, but a very, in a way, powerful way of reestablishing these borders. We definitely don't move towards a borderless world, at least not for the less privileged. If you have an access card, you have the right passport, you can fly through these airports and you can cross borders. But for others, these walls have become very thick and very high indeed.
Thank you, Oliver, for sharing with us all the consequences of this liberal paradox. If we look now more closely at the European Union level, We know that immigration was key to Brexit vote. Since 2016 and since 2020, the EU has continued to reform the European asylum system. The reform will tighten border controls, favor deterrence, establish a mechanism for financing wars in third countries. In brief, the new pact looks like a nightmare for migrants and asylum seekers. In parallel, the Mediterranean Sea has become the deadliest border in the world. The Schengen area creates freedom of movement without control at internal borders, but in return implies the strengthening of external borders with police and judicial cooperation. This hardening of the external borders of the Schengen space constitutes a key objective of the EU's internal migration policy. It implies collaboration with third countries on migration control. And we can estimate that the development of the European integrated border management system, which includes all these pre-border and post-border dimensions with camps, is not compatible with the rights of refugees, asylum seekers, and other migrants in vulnerable situations. Some scholars add that the European bordering processes are a type of racial borders. So my question is this one in this context. What do migration studies have to say when borders are a concrete, physical, political, and deadly policies and practices? Aren't migration studies one of the best critical laboratories in border studies?
Benny, I think you summarized the discussion quite well, and you allude to what I think is a fundamental ethical challenge that shapes our political times. It is, on the one hand, you have those Western democracies, and the European Union describes itself, right, as here, respecting fundamental international rights. The political right to asylum is a fundamental political right cherished by international law and Western liberal democracies, right? So there is a commitment towards those who seek refuge from disaster, from warfare and political prosecution. At the same time, and I started to talk about this, the political environment in most of these Western democracies is such that people push for more and more borders, more and more ways of keeping people out. You alluded to the Brexit vote, right? It was all about really anti-immigrant sentiments being mobilized for getting the UK out of the European Union. So in this respect, what we see is a very important segment of the political arena and parties. They have made anti-immigrant and pro-fortifying border policies the cornerstone of their political campaigns. Think about currently about the presidential election campaigns in the US that is starting now. I think the border will be one of the key themes in this contest. And it is all about, how do we keep people out that are allegedly undesirable? You still have this kind of paradox that I described earlier, that the United States is very dependent on the influx of people working in their economy. Much of the growth of the economy can be attributed to people coming in and working in the United States. At the same time, you have a political environment in which one of the contenders, namely former President Trump, makes anti-immigrant sentiments, the crucial ideological piece for his plea to be reelected. So, this prevents then any kinds of effective and also normatively desirable policies to be implemented. How do we account for the suffering of other people, and what is our responsibility as relatively rich, resourceful Western democracies? What should we do about this? And it is a real conundrum. We briefly talked about how the EU has externalized this challenge by essentially paying off other countries like Turkey to keep those refugees on the other continent, right? And now there's talk in the UK to use other countries in Africa to basically ship undesirable migrants too. So you can see here, it speaks to a helplessness in coming up with a proper way, one that recognizes some degree of responsibility and fundamental rights attributed to those refugees. There has been recently an attempt with the Global Compact for Migration at the UN level to come up with some kind of layer of rights that say, while it's still based on state sovereignty, there should be some commitment and responsibility for non-discriminatory human rights protection for these most vulnerable in the world, right? Yeah, so there has been a push on the global scale, but really what we see on the ground is often, how can we prevent this from becoming our problem, right? Do we keep people off? And that's what we see in the European Union with the fortification of the external borders, with Frontex taking a more and more aggressive approach to keeping migrants out, the pushbacks in the Mediterranean Sea, all those human rights violations that come with it. So that is a highly frustrating, politically and for me personally, right? It's a frustrating situation, but that one that results from, in a way, the inability to come up with effective policy making and a way, for the world community to react to this. It's basically every country tries to keep this out of their territory, not my backyard. And, we hope that this problem goes away, which clearly it won't. Think climate change, this will become worse. So the fundamental ethical and political challenge, I think, will become more and more accentuated as we go forward. And I think there's a really urgent need for the international community, the world community, to address this, either through the UN system or the European Union. I think it's been frustrating, to use a mild word, in terms of a lack of progress on this front.
Thank you very much, Oliver. It's a nice discussion about these global ethical challenges and inequalities between the global North, the privileged, and the global South. In the world of political activism, there are different movements: the pro-borders, the no-borders, and the no one is illegal. The theme of the border is finally at the center of the debates on human migrations. At the opposite side of the border control, we have seen the development of solidarity and citizen aid to migrants. How are these dimensions of mutual assistance at borders understood in migration studies?
So you can see why borders are often identified as a major obstacle to free and fair movement of people, right? So it is the side that we see on TV, right? We see people desperately trying to cross these borders, be it on the Mexican-American border, be it in the south of Europe, the Mediterranean Sea, the Balkan routes, right? We see the desperation and the real effects of borders. And you could indeed argue that borders are a fundamental piece in the logic of the Westphalian nation state logic, right? That there are compartmentalized nation states defined by strict borders, and also the ability to control who crosses these borders, right? That's the rationale very much of the modern nation state project, and borders have been a major piece of this. But only to focus on the exclusionary quality of borders is only half the story, because there are those who say we shouldn't have any borders, but in a world that is so divided along in terms of prosperity, of rights, of political systems, it would be very hard to simply do away with borders and then expect that this would lead to necessarily more freedom, a liberty for all, because the reality is, that we have, in a way, a highly divided world, and in a way, we need to govern crossing these borders that we have in a proper way. So borders can be also facilitating this move from one side to the other, from one state to the other. So we need, in a way, proper border management and governments to allow this. So you could have more and liberal and free migration policies with a border. So it's not whether there's no border, but rather what is the character of border governments? How well is it done? How much freedom does it allow people to cross it? So I think it is a bit naive to think that if we do away with borders, we would get rid of all the problems. There are some who say, would have an immediate positive effect on the world economy, but you can also see that it would create a whole set of problems. And maybe, hopefully not too theoretical. If you think about what borders allow us to do, they're in a way functional prerequisites for the spatial organization of our democracy, of the welfare state. They determine, who can vote in an election, who has an entitlement for welfare state payments and social systems. So in a way, this is how our administrative world is being organized, right? And unless we have a different principle of doing this, having a world government on the one hand, or smaller units, it will be very hard to live in a world without these borders. In a way, the regular and properly managed way of defining the boundaries of our political communities, right? And so clearly the European Union has been an attempt, right? You're pushing this as a political union to say, maybe we need something bigger than the nation state. But, democracies themselves can't determine this. It's very hard by majority rule to say, these are the borders of our community. And it creates all kinds of problems, as we know, minority nationalism in Europe. So borders, I think, could be, and in a way, realistically will be a major puzzle in good immigration policies, in desirable migration policies. So it's not about not having a border, but a well-managed border, and one that is primarily a site of transit and empowering people. I think that is the better way of framing this. But, you can also see how at the same time, political forces on the ground use this insecurity related to the border in terms of, here what we see, open borders. It's kind of the red flag for the populist right at the moment, right? Yeah, they even now accuse Biden of allowing an open border on the Mexican U.S. borderline, which is not the case. But you can see how it creates this fundamental sense of insecurity, of being threatened, and it speaks to almost an ontological dimension of the border, right? A kind of Hobbesian tale of you can only be secure and protected within the bordered national community. And that is something that we see playing out in politics at the moment, that the border becomes a reference point for being safe in a world that is ridden by crises, right? That is fundamentally challenged. So there is a fundamental populist nationalist backlash against being creative and creating also an ethically defendable border policy, right? So we have to be aware of this. And if you think about open borders, what would happen if you really open the borders? This political backlash might become far more acute and lead to a radicalization in politics that you don't want to see as well, because that would have even more negative implications for migrants and those seeking refuge in particular, right? So you can see here how, the no border option might actually set into motion something that then comes to a dramatically different outcome than what is intended here, which is a free world in which people can freely choose where they want to live.
Yes, a very complex question, Oliver. And to finish this first part of the podcast, borders can also be instruments for the benefit of diverse identity dynamics. You just spoke about that. Or in French, mouvement identitaire. There are also legal categorizations that reinforce the juridical and real borderization of the world. Legal, illegal, citizen, foreigner, etc. What about the effects of borders and all these categories on the national imagination? And that's the last question of the first part of the podcast.
And it will allow us to make this transition to questions about democracy, because what we've seen, and I've now referenced this a couple of times already, how border security, they have, in a way, become a major reference point in competitive party politics. And you see here that borders, beyond being a place that is being governed by policies, by regulations, it is also a feature in the political imagination of those who try to determine what is a legitimate political community, what is our identity, who belongs legitimately, and who should not be here. So, in this respect, borders have a performative power in defining, in a way, how this political community should look like and who should have access to our territory, to this political community. And what we see here is this kind of resurgence of a sovereigntist discourse, which is kind of paradoxical in a globalizing world, that people go back now to the nation state and say we can only be safe, or being invited by political actors to say we can only be safe once we are fully protected from the outside world, and immigrants are those that undermine our prosperity, security, and so forth. Right? This is a very powerful political rhetoric, and we see this playing out. Again, let me reference U.S. politics. Trump makes this protection of the border and sovereignty of the nation state the cornerstone of his political campaign. At some stage in 2018, he said, every nation has not only the right, but the absolute duty to protect its borders and its citizens. A nation without borders is a nation not at all. So you can see here a very, the attempt to say, I'm the protector of the sovereign rights of the people. And what it means is, I protect you from all the ill that comes in from outside. Clearly a argument that everything bad needs to come in from outside, right? If we close the border, we will be safe. All those things, illness, economic turmoil, all this comes in from outside. But it's a very powerful one. And it is one that we are used to. And in terms of the Westphalian nation state model, we've been trained to think along those lines, right? It is the sovereign, the political power needs to protect us from the ills coming in from outside. It is a very powerful narrative that is being mobilized now in political debates. And you can see the performative role that boundaries and borders play in this context.
Thank you very much, Oliver. It's the end of our first part of our podcast. In conclusion, border studies and migration studies are intertwined and interrelated profoundly and deeply.